I oppose the amendment and would like to address that and a little bit about the underlying bill. Look, when you go in for, say, hip replacement surgery, Medicare reimburses the hospital for everything that goes into that surgery. It's called a bundled payment. So that includes the cost of the physician, the nurses, the anesthesiologist, surgical supplies, everything, including post-operative pain medication. So the incentive now is to use the cheapest alternative in each point, right? Because the money you don't spend on the doctor or post-operative pain, you get to keep as the provider. If physicians want to use a more expensive post-operative non-opioid analgesic, the amount of the bundle payment doesn't increase. And so the physician or the hospital doesn't get reimbursed for the extra cost. So there's a strong incentive. We are incentivizing the use of opioids, which are cheap. The cost of opioids is $20 for 120 tablets of 5 milligrams of oxycodone. Okay? So we're telling providers it's in your economic interest to use these opiates. Our legislation opens up another avenue. It says, listen, if you can prove to CMS, and again, some people have suggested Congress is making the decision or the doctor. No, but you have to prove to CMS that there's a substantial benefit in terms of clinical performance for an alternative. They're allowed to pay extra for a certain amount of time. The effect of that is to create an incentive to develop alternatives. You know, the fact that there are few existing options is in part because there's no market. If Medicare says to you, you have to compete against a $20 pill or $20 bottle of pills, what incentive is that for someone to develop alternatives? There is none. But it's not an open door. You have to prove to CMS the exact language that there's demonstrated clinical improvement as a result of this bill. Then they can pay you extra. That's all this is. I've heard concerns that the policy is addressing a problem that doesn't exist, but my staff and I have heard from dozens of patient groups, patient advocates, doctors, anesthetists, and anesthesiologists who don't agree. And there are people on the ground who are telling us that it's critical that patients have access to new innovative therapies to treat post-surgical pain. We have the support of the American Society of Interventional Pain Physicians, which represents over 4,500 interventional pain physicians across the country, the American Society of Anesthesiologists, and patient groups like Hope United. And the policy was not dreamed up here. It was from a 2003 MedPAC recommendation that, quote, the Secretary should introduce clinical criteria for eligibility of drugs and biologicals to receive pass-through payments, that's these extra payments, under the outpatient prospective payment system. So this makes a lot of sense to get us away from this. Why would we want to stay in the situation where we are incentivizing the use of opioids, which we know are cheap? Opioid-related adverse events cost hospitals billions or the potential to develop new persistent, we're talking about something that's costing us total $78 billion a year for this problem, $78 billion a year. We got a CBO score on our bill of over 10 years, $150 to $200 million. All right? And the point is, if you use an alternative that's not an opioid, at the end of that, you come out not addicted. So we have to find better ways to treat this problem where it starts. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And I appreciate the co-sponsorship of Mr. Bouchon and Ms. Eshoo, which is very greatly appreciated. With respect to the amendment, the problem with the amendment is that it starts by striking my entire bill. So you can't have the amendment and the bill. The first part of it is strike section 2. That's the whole bill. So you can't add this amendment in. It's by definition inconsistent. I don't have a particular problem with the amendment in that it creates a public comment process, but that's not an alternative to creating a market. We are in a crisis. Let's not go back for a government study and pat ourselves in the back like we did something. Let's create a market for these alternatives. And second, the budget neutrality, there's a downside of the budget neutrality, which sounds good, which is that to pay more for opioid alternatives, you have to take money away from something else. We know we're going to hear from hospitals about how thin the margins are already. We have to create a market. This is a sensible way to do it. I urge my colleagues to reject the amendment and to support the underlying bill. And I think.
Will the gentleman